Welcome to BSc 1083. This is chapter 1, and it is a first look at anatomy. On our first slide here, you can see that we have a student who is studying an anatomical model shown on the left side of the screen right here. This anatomical model shows us what we call an anterior view, which means the front. You can see a cavity here, which is called the thoracic cavity, also the abdominal pelvic cavity. So that's one way that we can observe anatomy. Another way that we can observe anatomy is by looking at cadavers. And we'll be looking at some of those throughout the semester as well. Shown over here is an anatomical model of the brain, and specifically, it's what we call a mid-sagittal section. So one thing that will be introduced in this chapter specifically is utilizing some directional terms and some planes in this case. Our next slide is showing that anatomy is the study of structure. So it's what we see. And the Greek term for this is to cut apart. So that's how scientists first identified structures, was to cut them apart, cutting a cadaver apart, dissecting it like a medical student would do. Physiology is the study of function. It's not something that we will be doing that much in this class, but it's very difficult to actually separate anatomy and physiology. However, with the quizzes and the smart book assignments and the chapter quizzes that you'll be doing this semester, I've tried to kind of focus the questions and the activities on just anatomy, but there will be some physiology. For example, when we get to the endocrine system, we can't help but talk about some of the different hormones. So anatomy and physiology are very interrelated. So let's talk about some examples of anatomy and physiology. With the small intestine specifically, it contains a type of epithelium, which is called simple columnar epithelium. And that simple columnar epithelium, it looks like pillars. And on the tip of the plasma membrane are what are called villi. These villi increase the surface area and allow for the physiology, which is the function for absorption of molecules like nutrients that are in the small intestine at the time. So the physiology is the fact that the epithelium of the small intestine absorbs these nutrients. So anatomists and physiologists both use the scientific method. It's not important that you know the parts of the scientific method, but when we do use the scientific method, scientists develop what is called a hypothesis. It's a general belief in what you think is going to happen during the experiment. So one example of anatomy is at a very small level, which we cannot see with the naked eye. It requires a microscope. And that microscopy allows us to examine structures that are too small to be seen with the unaided eye. So a subtype of microscopic anatomy would be what's called cytology, and that's the study of cells. Another example would be histology, which is the study of tissues. Another example of anatomy is what's called gross anatomy. That's what we can see with the naked eye, the unaided eye. Examples of studying gross anatomy would be what's called comparative anatomy, where there are similarities and differences that are compared across different species. Another example would be developmental anatomy, where structural changes are studied from conception through maturity. Embryology would be happening even earlier than developmental anatomy. It would be also looking at changes, but during development of the embryo, so prior to birth. Another type of anatomy is regional anatomy, which is studies within a specific region of the body. So let's say, for example, we want to look at the neck region. We're going to be looking at muscles, nerves, blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, anything that's in that specific region of the neck. With gross anatomy comes other subtypes like surface anatomy, which is superficial, and internal structures as they relate to the location of the body. So again, what you can see with the unaided eye. Systemic anatomy would be structures that are involved with a specific activity within a system. An example of this could be looking at the structures of the cardiovascular system, for example. Pathological anatomy is very interesting. Pathological anatomy tends to look at anatomy that is associated with disease. So the word pathology actually means disease. Radiographic anatomy has to do with structures that are studied with the help of medical imaging processes like ultrasound, MRI, or X-ray. And lastly on this slide is surgical anatomy, the study of anatomical landmarks before and after surgery. So let's say, for example, we are using the hip bones as a landmark to find the lumbar forevertebrae prior to back surgery. That would be an example of surgical anatomy. And let's hope your surgeon knows the exact location of the L4 vertebrae if you're getting operated on for something like a herniated disc. This slide is showing us examples of the levels of organization in the human body. And we see the simplest level of organization in the human body is the chemical level. And it includes things like atoms and molecules. The cellular level, this happens to be an example of a cell that we would find in the small intestine. These finger-like projections that you see here are what are called villi. And within the cellular level, there are other structures actually found in the cell, which are called organelles. The next level of organization is the tissue level, and the tissue level includes four different types of tissue. There is epithelial tissue, as you can see on the screen. There's also muscle, connective, and nervous tissue. So in a couple chapters, we're actually going to have an entire chapter on histology, which is the tissues. The next level of organization is the organ level. Then we have organ system level. And one of the things that you'll need to know for this chapter are the different organ systems that we have in the body. And for the digestive system has these organs, which I've highlighted. It also has other organs as well, like the esophagus, above the esophagus where the throat is. That is called the pharynx, the oral cavity as well. And we'll be talking about other systems as well.